Alrighty, let's get this show started. Hello everyone, good evening. I'm Micaela Cohen-Fuentes. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome you all to PNP Live. Thank you for joining us in a virtual format in the midst of truly extraordinary times. We strive to continue to bring you the authors and books that you love. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Ben Lerner's book, The Topeka School, on the Politics and Prose website. If you have any questions for Ben or Ocean Vuong, who will be in conversation with him, please use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, but because there's so many of you, we regret that we won't get to all the questions. Before we begin, we want to sincerely thank you for being with us today. We're so grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. This is a very challenging time for small businesses, including independent bookstores, and your support means everything to us. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Ben Lerner is an American poet, novelist, essayist, and critic. He has been a Fulbright Scholar, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, a finalist for the National Book Award, and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, to name just a few. Lerner teaches at Brooklyn College, where he was named a distinguished professor of English in 2016. His newest novel, The Topeka School, is set in the Midwest at the turn of the century. It's a tale of adolescence, transgression, and the conditions that have given rise to the trolls and tyrants of the new right. Tonight, we are thrilled to have Ben Lerner in conversation with Ocean Vuong. Ocean Vuong is the author of the critically acclaimed poetry collection, Night Sky with Exit Wounds, and the New York Times bestselling novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Thank you again for joining us on PNP Live, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to our amazing authors.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michaela. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really happy to talk to Ben. I'm always happy to talk to Ben, but this is, I think, the first time we get to talk in this public way about your work. I've known you for over 10 years, most of my writing life, and so much of my own thinking, is often propelled, inspired, challenged by your own. And so you're someone whose work I've always been sort of endeavoring to work and become as complicated in the way it thinks and in the way it moves and the way it embodies the world, first as my teacher, but then as a friend. And so I just want to just say I'm really happy to do this. It's a deep privilege of mine. And I want to just open with a very, to me, a very urgent question is, how are you doing in this wild times? I know you are a father now with 2 beautiful children. What's it like being a father while the world is smoldering at its edges?
Yeah, thanks for doing this, Ocean, and thanks to Politics and Prose for hosting it. I was saying to Ocean before we started that my daughters were told that I was going to be doing an event with Ocean and had to be dragged out of the house kicking and screaming because they wanted to, I think they thought he was going to be in the house, but they wanted to see him. The whole family is in love with Ocean. How are we doing? I mean, we're really lucky. We have space and we have all kinds of material privilege. And Ariana, as you know, my wife is like, her field is education, and she's doing a really great job at, she's kind of taking a lead in organizing a pedagogic world for the children. So we're doing okay. I mean, I'm alternatingly abstracted and terrified about the kind of authoritarian buffoonery in the White House and the open, unapologetic white supremacy and the announcement of an imminent coup and whatnot. But I'm more grateful than ever for the things I'm grateful for. And happy to get to have conversations like this in which we can talk about something that isn't, just the rhythm of the 24-hour news cycle, and kind of talk about the slower work of literature, which both is totally at the mercy of the present, but also kind of looks beyond it. So I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
Hanging in there. I think the pandemic lockdown vibe is quite suitable to me. It's the first time where I don't have to explain myself for not going to events and seeing people. It's a great time for an introvert, but I wish it happened under more, auspicious circumstances. But it helps to have this sort of retraction, and turn inward, turn towards back those closest to me. I'm trying to set up my home so my brother can come live with us. He was living with my mother when she passed, and so he's going to try to come in December or January. And so it's going to have we're going to be a family, I guess, in a very unorthodox way. But it's exciting how I'm thinking about care often, and which is kind of one of the questions I wanted to ask you, particularly about this notion of autofiction, which is something that has arisen in the past few decades, but it has also, I saw, to my eyes, deeply entrenched in the tradition of the American novel, a la Melville, Plath, Catcher in the Rye, Baldwin's Go Tell It to the Mountain, Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye. And often, I think, for me, when I think about care, you're one of the writers that I think about often. And when we think about autofiction, it's often, a thinly veiled memoir. When we think autobiographical modes, we think of it as a quote unquote, a handicap or a cheat, someone not doing the real work of plot or invention and imagination. But of course, a writer like yourself, I know for a fact, would never do something without deep, deep consideration. And I guess my question for you is, what were the main drives and draws of the autobiographical mode for you? What are the advantages of the form, the medium, and what, now that you've written 3 in novels in that vein, what have you discovered that you didn't expect?
Yeah, that's a good, I mean, the first novel that I wrote, I was really interested in the novel as like a vehicle for thinking about poetry and thinking about questions about like aesthetic experience and anxiety about what constitutes authentic experience. And I thought it would be most alive. I mean, it's not that I totally knew what I was doing, but I just thought that those issues would be most charged if I kind of implicated my life as a poet and the work I had done. So I think that at first, since the book was so concerned about questions of fraudulence and authenticity and authorship and the relation between poetry and prose, using biographical material was a way of actually charging the novel with some of the questions I'd been interested in, as a matter of fact, in poetry and in criticism. But I think what I discovered in writing that novel, which was a novel about poetry and thinking through aesthetic experience, but also brought up all kinds of questions about the self and intergenerationality and what it might mean to be an artist in a certain kind of technological and economic condition, et cetera, that then I was really interested in doing a kind of genealogy of my own voice and kind of trying to think about the things that formed or deformed me as a writer and a thinker and as a person. So I think it started as kind of like a tactical, specific interest that had to do with moving from poetry to fiction as a vehicle for poetry criticism. And then it kind of opened up into a broader psychological landscape. And I think part of the reason why it was writable for me to stay in that vein was because, I mean, on the one hand, if you write about yourself, you're understandably open to the charge of narcissism. And the first novel was really about this kind of solipsistic narrator who could barely kind of see other people because he was so caught in this fugue of anxiety. But there is a way in which it can be narcissistic, but it also is a way of refusing the position of omniscience and universality, right? Which is kind of the opposite of narcissism. That is, like, I wanted to be able to write novels that weren't like, I'm writing a novel from a position of nowhere. Like, I really, yeah. So, so I think that autofiction, ironically for me, was like a way of marking the particularity of like class experience and the experience of whiteness and the experience of trying to be an artist, negotiating those things for better or for worse. So Yeah, it was a way of refusing universality while also negotiating that issue of narcissism. I mean, the last thing I'd say about it is Aaron Cunyan once said to me, I mean, I've never understood why this is true, but he once said to me a really long time ago that like you should make art out of the material about which you're most ashamed. And I think I learned from like Bernhard and other writers that sometimes it's like really like the novel could be a space to go at your anxieties, like kind of go for broke, like see what kind of authenticity you can unfurl from a kind of shame spiral, or to like really deal with the material that you're most uncomfortable with. And so I kind of got into that idea of thinking through some of the aspects of my experience that are not necessarily cause for celebration, but to try to make them the ground for like a real intellectual inquiry or emotional inquiry anyway.
No, everything you're saying is so fascinating. I'm getting really excited. I was thinking about your poetry collection, Mean Free Path, in which there are these almost this contrapuntal form where there are multiple sort of syntactic units can be picked up later on and delayed, right? So there's multiple readings, which leaves the poem as a site of sort of inexhaustible agency, even as it has already calcified as a text. So the reader has to constantly participate. And I wonder if, you know, our generations, you know, folks in their 20s and 30s and early 40s, there's this sort of negotiate a virtual reality, if you will, and that the stakes in autofiction is that we're almost creating a simulation of the conditions of our world that can be played out with control and care, right? Because I think in living, we only have one draft at life, whereas in a novel, we can have multiple drafts. And I guess, you know, my response to what you're saying is sort of my own take on autofiction is that the stakes are so real, and then they're sort of put parallel to our world. And I think, I wonder how you feel, but I feel like when I think I'm interested in the personal and biographical stakes because I'm too cowardly to ask these difficult questions of the people I love. I think I would crumble if I were to ask, you know, anyone in my family the questions that I asked of these characters in the novel. Do you see that this sort of interface is something that is a part of our technological world, perhaps even with social media, where the sort of avatar is always about negotiating a self and the idea of a self in the actual personhood, which is much more intricate, perhaps even to us.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things novels I feel like are really good at is kind of showing the disconnect between the way we present ourselves socially and our internal experience, right? And like that, maybe that's one of the things the novel does that kind of no other medium can do so effectively. And so while so much about contemporary social media or whatever is about kind of curating an image of the self, what you don't get, so far as I understand it, like you don't get the internal experience of the thing that's being curated for social consumption. It's not to say that social media can't also be meaningful platforms for interconnection, but right, but like so much of it is about this, the increasing colonization of the life world by this like technology of spectacularization, which, even though it's giving more and more access to the inside of people's lives, is giving less and less access to what internal experience is. And so the novel, sometimes for really comic effects, sometimes in other ways that can be quite moving, is really good at showing the experience that at least I have all the time of the gap between like the face I present to the world and my internal experience of it. And so I think that there is a way where a fictional avatar, like an auto-fictional avatar, is an example to kind of show the underside and maybe more complicated psychological process of that negotiation. And that's like a really traditional thing that the novel can do, right? Is depict consciousness and also depict social interaction. So I think of it as like that part of why people are interested maybe in this thing called autofiction, or maybe rediscovering the novel's ability to be a kind of different form of the exploration of an avatar, is because it gives you the drama of self-presentation and all the different forces that are determining that drama, but it also gives you the internal experience through language of, you know, of like what's happening to interiority while there is this this interaction with the outside world, which is like part of why I think my fiction, like a lot of fiction, gets obsessed with faces. It's like the face, you're preparing this face for your social interaction, but like behind that face is this whole world of anxiety or conflict or whatever.
Yeah, and shame, you said, and
Yeah.
I think when I think about that, I think of this, I think an ongoing theme to various degrees in all of your texts, really, even to the poems, even going back to Lichtenberg figures, of this notion of failure, formal failure, social failure, the failure to meet certain standards in Topeka, I would say, the sort of a heteronormative white male standard, whatever it is, which we'll know changes depending on what city you're in and what region you're from. How have you negotiated failure through the various forms of your books? And how important is it for your literature to be a way to discover failure, both personal and in the social context that we're in, and now political, particularly this last book?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I mean, I know we've talked about that Creeley poem, For Love, on a couple of occasions, right? This beautiful Robert Creeley poem in which it's kind of the whole poem tracks this effort to make a definitive statement about love and kind of tracks the failure to do so. And then kind of at the end, there's this moment where you realize that the kind of experience of loving in time and in the world is better captured by Creeley's hesitation and his stumbling by any like perfect mimesis of idealized speech or whatever, like the failures of expression are expressive. And this idea that like part of what literary form does is manages to communicate a feeling that would be falsified by mere description. So I think, you know, like in Mean Free Path that you mentioned, like I was very interested in this kind of like how could hesitation or delay or recombination dramatize a feeling as opposed to just trying to make a polished statement about a feeling. And I think in novels, I think that translates to a couple of things for me. Like one is that I'm interested in the way novels can end not with a moment of resolution, like, you know, in the marriage plot when everybody gets married and class is reproduced perfectly or whatever. I mean, not that that's what everybody's doing now, but also like to have as an open question at the end of a novel whether or not a protagonist has undergone change, right? To have novels end at a kind of threshold or in a feedback loop as opposed to in a moment of triumph. And also, I think, you know, in the Topeka School, it's really organized around these theaters of extreme speech where language is pushed to a breaking point, where there really is a failure of significance, where there's a kind of glossolalia or speaking in tongues, or language breaks up under the pressurized silences of therapy or whatever. And to think about those moments of linguistic breakdown as dystopian to a certain degree, right? Like language has failed, but also as having this glimmer of possibility because they're moments where we confront the possibility of building a new language or kind of like re-encounter the mundane miracle of language, that we can build a social world out of sound. And of course, trying to put a hopeful spin on linguistic failure is one of the ways the book tries to bear on the present, because I think like with Trump speak or whatever, the only good news in the kind of fascist buffoonery of Trump and his not, you know, the kind of the frankness with which he lies is that the truth he's telling is the necessity of there being a total reinvention of the language of politics, right? That he kind of spells the end of a neoliberal fantasy of putting a humane face on an inhumane system. And what we have to try to do somehow is hear the moment of truth and his murderous, disorganized speech. And the moment of truth is that there has to be a totally different relationship to language that can actually make contact with reality and be the foundation of some mode of sociality, as opposed to just having like a kind of neoliberal order on one hand and the kind of Trump demagoguery on the other. So I think linguistic failures have always been to me moments of collapse and also possible renovation. And I don't think that's like an original idea. I think there's like a real, I mean, to a certain degree, maybe that's built into poetry, you know, the failure to reach the right margin, the felt silences of white space. But I hear poets talk about it more than novelists.
Right. Poetry, a form that in a way has to break itself towards unity. And I think the fracture or the resistance to closure is built into how a poet moves forward towards composition, where that's not always the case in prose, or at least it's not demanded of prose. And
Right.
so I guess my next question in that vein would be, you know, you talk about, we can argue that poetry in a way is negotiating the failure of language at its most sharpest edges, on its most molecular level. And eventually for you, you move from that exercise, that endeavor, to prose, which is, you know, demands cohesion. You know, even the sentence itself is something that is forced to be linear. It's a linear medium, regardless of how we manipulate time and within it. So you're going from one place that sort of celebrates the possibility of failure into a medium that is, you know, used by newspapers, textbooks, right, novels, particularly the 19th century novel of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, where, you know, the omniscient power, the sort of authority of the author, you know, reigns supreme. So how have you sort of utilized failure from one genre into another, especially in these three? I'm interested in how failure changes within these three novels.
Mm-hmm. Man, I'm more interested in your answer to each of these questions than my
I have any answers tonight. All questions, so.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful question. I mean, I think one, you know, I mean, I think that and I mean, I don't know what you would say, but I see this as also true in some of your own work, that like one of the things that happens when a poet moves, or certain poets move from poetry to prose for a while, is that the novel becomes really more about pattern than plot, you know, because the sonic pattern, all the kinds of patterning that are involved in a poem can also be used to shape a novel. It doesn't mean that things don't happen, but patterning is so much about not just making progress, right? Like the way that we're driven to repeat behavior, or the way that our voices, you know, are to a certain degree a tissue made out of the voices that precede us, and all the different cultural and historical forces that are coursing through us, even at our supposedly most intimate moment. So I think, you know, I mean, I think that a lot of the novels that matter to me, I mean, I loved, I mean, the 19th century is pretty great for novels, right? Like, but like a lot of the novels that contemporary novels, or relatively contemporary novels, that speak to me like in totally different modes, like Sebald on the one hand or Javier Marias on the other, are really concerned with pattern, and with people who think the past is past only to re-encounter it in their own behavior. So I think, you know, in this novel, I mean, the Topeka School, right, is very much literally, I mean, it's about prehistory. It's both a prehistory to two other novels, but it's about kind of family prehistory and how patterns can be illuminated, and when they're illuminated, potentially altered, so that you're not just driven to repeat behavior. But I think for me, the common art in poetry and prose, although there are lots of differences, is to think of them as theaters for pattern making and pattern breaking, like the expectations that can be created by pattern making that you then strategically disappoint. The scale for me is a little different in a poem or in a novel, but I think that's the through line for me.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned Sebald, because I think Sebald's technique was to essentially turn memory and history into weather. Like he literally interrupts his walk, right?
Yeah.
In Rings of Saturn to sort of negotiate the things that has happened in his world. And I think that's also a moment where the fictive world that the author builds is one that is precarious. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I really love about your work, is that there's a precarity that feels very relatable to an actually lived life, even though we know this is fiction, that it's entrenched in the imaginary, animated by an author's mind. And I guess, you know,
I've never heard somebody say, that's a really interesting idea. Like, I think you're articulating something I've thought a lot about, but have never figured out the language to say. Or you're saying, like, one of the, like, the normal term of praise in fiction is like, oh, it's a totally, you know, the world is totally beautiful and secure. I was absorbed in this alternative reality. And you're saying that, if I understand you, that like part of the power of a fictional world can be its precarity, that it's delicate, that it's barely held together by an effort of the author and the imagination. And that, I think, is a really nice way to think about, like, that often what's beautiful in fiction is and maybe poets are more likely to emphasize this, is like, I'm trying to represent this world of my parents, or I'm trying to imagine my parents' voices, and I'm barely keeping it together. Right. And like the effort and the emotional charge is not in the virtuosic stability of this fictional world. It's exactly in the dramatic effort and the delicacy and the way the voices crack, or the kind of weather trembles under the emotional force of the imaginative effort. And that is, I've never heard somebody say, oh, what I loved about this novel was how precarious the fictional world was. But that's really useful for me. Like, I'm gonna start, I'm gonna steal that from you.
Yeah, I'm glad, because it's already out of my mind. I can't repeat it.
It was my idea.
You're right, because even when a very critical phrase in a lot of reviews of anyone's work is often the word uneven, right? This book of poems is uneven, this novel is uneven. And I think it's really interesting that we demand cohesion out of a genre that we often also demand authenticity, right? We say, I don't believe it. It's not real. This is not done well enough, so I believe the stakes here. I don't care for the character. And I think the precarity is often, for me, what binds me to the author in a sort of kinship, that I understand this desire to keep it together whenever it's falling apart, especially while utilizing one of our species' most smallest tools, language. There's so many of them. They're so fickle, and it's tedious to put them together.
And they die out.
Yeah, and they're changing while we're pinning them down. While we pin it down, language just kind of melts around us. It's so wild. Maybe this is why often a lot of us enter sanatoriums. I don't know, that's another thread I won't go down. But I wanted to talk about this trilogy. Oftentimes, trilogies, for me, it seems like they kind of end in an arbitrary state. You can feel that the writer maybe just wrote enough, and then they want to publish it, and they kind of just feel like the binding of the book becomes an arbitrary closure. Whereas for your books, they seem very distinct. They have their own tonal variations. They have their certain patterns that have their arc. And they also have various scopes of their political engagements. In other words, they feel very distinct, but also fluid in their worlds, right? And so I guess, was it always your intention to write a trilogy? And if so, why make them so distinct in this way? Was there a decision to make them distinct rather than sort of serialized? They don't feel serialized to me.
Right. It certainly wasn't like when I wrote the first novel. I mean, first I was really resistant to the idea that I was writing a novel. Like, I had that poet thing that I'll never write a novel. And then I thought it would be my only novel, because like poets were allowed to write one novel, that, the poet's novel. And then, the second novel, like I wrote this long poem that the kind of novel grew around as a frame. Like, I was again really resistant to writing the novel. I mean, it was very much explicitly about, the way that the stories we tell, like the way fact informs fiction and the way fictions then become facts in our lives. So there was a kind of explicit diptych between the two novels. Once I gave in and was really writing one, there was a relation. this one was different for me because I don't know if it's just like some weird rule of threes thing. Like I had 3 books of poems. I mean, I had collaborations, but the books of poems that were really mine, I had 3 of them. And I did feel like, you know, the first novel was so much still about this kid kind of leaving home. And the second novel was about kind of thinking about, also about like futurity, like mortality. The narrator gets this, you know, medical diagnosis. His friends wants his help getting pregnant. It was about kind of imagining futurity in an increasingly fragile planet. And then I wanted in the third novel, like I felt like I did want to write the third term in a series, but I wanted to write like a book that was as different as possible within the series. Like I didn't want to write another clearly first person narration that just updated the other 2. And I think what happened is that I was also, I mean, it was like this conjunction of things. Like I was a father remembering when you, at least when I have kids, I think this is probably pretty common, like you re-experience your childhood very vividly. Like when you look at this little kid who's throwing a fit about something or whatever, like you remember when you were that kid throwing a fit. So you're both are kind of looking down and looking up at the same time, which has always been this kind of way I've thought about fiction. Like you're kind of both writing the story, but you're also in the story. And all of this is to say that because of the way that having kids is both this new experience that intensifies your experience of the present, but is also this time machine that always sends you back to your own prehistory, I think it became clear to me that the way to write the third term in the trilogy and to finish it was by going back, like to write about the correspondence between the present and a particular past, which for me was largely, but not exclusively, like the 90s. And then that was also like the political circumstance. I mean, I was remembering the kind of the 90s where there was this end of history narrative, this kind of like liberal triumph that was going to be like a post-racial Clinton, post-ideological, technocratic solution to all the world's problems. And I was like remembering that white elite fantasy from the Trump era, and also remembering my own childhood in the 90s from the position of a father in the Trump era. So that is all to say that the themes of prehistory, my own experience of like vivid flashbacks as a parent, my own trying to think about the prehistory of the disastrous present on the political level, what it made writable was this kind of prequel. And that the way that I could finish the trilogy was about thinking through the theme of prehistory on both a formal level and the level of content simultaneously. So it was, I mean, this book was a book written that was about kind of like the third term in a trilogy, but at no moment prior to this book was I thinking I would like, that I knew what the next novel would do. But also I think it, you know, like all my books of poems are kind of serial works. So I think that the only way I know how to write is kind of by thinking about a relationship between books. Like what am I going to pull forward from the previous book, and what am I going to work against, and how are they going to communicate, and what lines is it going to steal from the next book, etc. So I mean, I'm overstating the degree to which I ever knew what I was doing, but that was the feeling. Like prehistory was the way to move forward. That was also a way of moving back.
It reminds me a lot of what you usually say in our class, which is like, how do we read in a way that we can define an inexhaustible work, and a work that is exhausted, right? And I think you kept encouraging us to try to formulate a text that it has inexhaustibility embedded into it as a way to resist, you know, so much around us, which is, you know, a bag of Doritos is exhaustible, but can a poem be exhausted? Can a book be exhausted? And I think that the strive to resist that, I think, has led to so much of your work. And I think perhaps I'm thinking now about the Bildungsroman, which has very narrow scope, right? Obviously, it's coming of age novel, particularly as it is utilized and wielded in American literature. You know, the more seminal ones, you know, Catcher in the Rye, The Bell Jar. they don't have prehistories. They're kind of obsessed with the present and maybe a near future. And they resolve themselves often when someone sort of, either goes home or graduates from school.
Right.
And you kind of write one throughout your trilogy, but then kind of don't in the traditional way. You kind of refuse that traditional scope by having a prehistory, but then also having this very truncated expat, young man's sort of education. I'm just thinking out loud here, but I wonder if this is like the best format to write a Bildungsroman, to write a coming of age story that also has to do with coming of art, coming to ethics, which I think a lot of the other traditional single shot Bildungsromans kind of ignore. They put all their weight into a very intensified state temporally, and then they're released. And I think maybe this is the best way to hold the complications of our world, is to just write more of it. That one book is not the definitive answer on how one regards the world. One might need 3 chances.
Mm-hmm.
In this sense, I was thinking about what Eliot often says about the canon, when he says, the work that comes now will redefine the work before. And I think this is also true in a writer's life. Do you think there are ways, I'm curious to know ways that you think that Topeka School helped redefine some of the elements in Atocha Station and 10-4?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I think like the kind of comic and obscene lie that the narrator tells in Leaving the Atocha Station about his mother being dead, when he's like lying to get the sympathy of attractive strangers or whatever, or testing out what it would mean to say that. I think that is really changed by the depiction of like the intimacy of the mother and the child in the Topeka School, or in 10-4, there is a lot of story, like there's a story about the narrator's grandmother, his paternal grandmother, that's told by the narrator's father, which I think is changed and has a different resonance if you've read the Topeka School. And the way that those fictions are always, or not even fiction, the way that the stories, just fiction in the sense of storytelling, are always subject to like redescription, like the way that the meaning of a story changes as the present in which you encounter it changes. Like that's part of what serial work enables you to do, is to kind of dramatize in the artwork the way that meaning is always subject to revision. And that can be terrifying. I mean, you can like, the things that you thought were fixed truths about your identity can suddenly be up for grabs, and there's a kind of vacuum. And it can also be really liberating, because it means that whatever this like one story that's told about you or that you've told about yourself can be unfixed and can be contested. So I think, I think what you're saying is really a useful way to think about it, that like seriality in our work, like whether it's a series of poems or like a series of novels, is a way of resisting any particular moment of closure and insisting on the way that, the meaning of events is always unstable, and both the kind of terror and vertigo that can attend that, and also the sense of possibility. And I mean, I think the Topeka School's like argument in part is that they're kind of like, I mean, this is like not a novel idea, but it's like that there are no grown-ups,
Yeah.
And that what you learn when you kind of grow up, whatever that means for you, is that there are no grown-ups, that everyone is still that memory is still the present, that you're still trying to figure it out, that you're still looking for guidance and kind of confronting the limits of your own knowledge, that you never graduate.
Right. And what I love about what the Topeka School does is that it has a power beyond itself, in that it has this responsibility of being the final installment. And what it does is that it renders, the latest work renders the definitive cover, the definitive borders in the other text porous. Now all of a sudden there's a retroactive change. We see Adam Gordon, who's creates these lies about his mother, this anxiety that she's ill back in the States. And we kind of wonder about that. And it is complete in itself, but then now when we arrive at Topeka School and we're dropped into this world so far away from Spain, so far away from this highfalutin, intelligista, poetry readings, museums, and we see the fabric of a family coming together in this way. The book is almost haunted by the earlier version, and they start to inform each other in a very nonlinear way. But then I think what you've done horizontally is perhaps what us poets have always understood vertically, is that the text always kind of, the patterning changes, again, like in Mean Free Path. I wonder if you turn the column in Mean Free Path just horizontally, and now your works are kind of informing each other in a horizontal plane through the novels.
Yeah, I mean, the formal procedure and like those poems is in part the way that every time you make an effort at speech, like your voice is a composite of all these other voices. And part of what the Topeka School wants to be about is the way that the older Adam Gordon, who's kind of imagining his past and the present as a father, is thinking through all the voices that make up his voice and what voices he wants to honor and what voices he wants to edit out. And that is like a recombinatory thing. It's an echo chamber, right? And he's not really in control of it. Like at the end of the novel, it's not that like Adam Gordon has triumphed over the voices of macho, violent positioning, or triumphed over the voices of his debate coach who weaponizes eloquence for right-wing politics. It's like it's all still there, and now and he's kind of, he has to figure out how, like what it means, what is he going to transmit intergenerationally or politically or professorially or whatever else, and like to what degree can he honor those strains of his voice that he feels are most fecund and loving, and to what degree can he move away from those other discourses. So yeah, I mean, I think to a certain degree, like for me, working in more than one genre is having like more than one laboratory in which to explore an idea. Like you said something when I went to your launch event in Brooklyn for your novel, back when people could gather inside at Books Are Magic. You said something about how people could always told, like after you wrote your first book of poems, that everybody was like, well, now you've got to write a totally different book. You can't repeat yourself. You can't go over some of this material. And you said this really great thing where you're like, I just wrote the same book as a novel. Like I just like the exact, like, which was a great idea and all kinds of ways. But like that is, I think like having more than one genre is having more than one laboratory. Nobody's going to like exhaust any of these ideas, right? But that you can learn something about them when you translate them from one mode to another.
Right. It's a way to almost resist this capitalistic anxiety that the product that we buy, in this case a book, should solve the problems it sets forth, right? And then that we will, and I think this is a lot of the promise of genre fiction, the crime thrillers, the romances, is that, to me, it's a very phallic projection of what a literature could be, which is that the promise of the killer you're promised a killer. You will find it in the detective. And this is why I think we crave it so much, is that it never fails on that capitalistic promise. It always delivers. And I think the power of stepping away from that and looking for other strategies is that we can get something much more closer to how we feel. And I think this is part of the discomfort, perhaps even the discomfort of poetry. I want to talk a little bit about your roots in poetry, particularly your teachers, the legendary Rosemary Waldrop and Keefe, publishers of Burning Deck. I mean, the things that they've done, they're truly multidisciplinary artists at heart. And I think what really interested me reading their texts and their essays is that they're the rare species of writers that do not privilege a genre. I would be hard pressed to call them any one practitioner. And so in our sort of literary fiction publication cycles, there's often a lot of surprise when someone breaks the genre, because genres are part of how, the press cycles and the book world works. Like, is it a book of poems? Is it a novel? Is it a memoir? These things are very important. They allow us to be placed on a shelf in the market. But I think your genesis as a writer happens much more organically. And of course, history has proven such. Melville wrote more lines of verse than Dickinson and Whitman combined. And with your teachers, it seemed like you would have naturally departed from poetry, or at least inevitably. Did you always felt that way? Or was there a moment where you thought poetry is no longer sufficient for what I'm trying to do? Or perhaps the novel has different tools that poems do not. What was the moment when you decided to write a novel, and was it so strange as many people like to believe?
I mean, Keith and Rosemary and were totally open to all these different modes of writing, and I think I don't know why I didn't have that in my mind immediately. I mean, I think I was like actually very resistant to writing a novel, because I identified, like, a lot of mainstream fiction just really baffled me because it seemed to privilege polish, and it seemed like kind of writing for television rooted through 19th century structures or something. I was just kind of like, I didn't get it. I mean, the tradition of the novel was always really exciting, but when I started finding myself writing prose, all these writers who have done more than one thing, their example really gave me permission. I mean, poetry remains the center for me, and poetry is at the center of all three novels in a different way. But by poetry, I really just mean writing that puts as much pressure as possible on language, and that understands form as a kind of content, right? That, like, the way you encounter the words in space and time, and the music of the language determines your emotional and intellectual experience of it. So I think they were like the Catholic with a little C taste of the Waldrops was really useful for me, for sure. I also think what I got a lot from the Waldrops was this like mixture of a total commitment to writing and a life in literature, and also this like sense of its absurdity, that like you shouldn't take yourself too seriously, like kind of like, why don't you get a real job? Like Keith and Rosemary both provided this space and this example of how you could have a life that was so attentive to language, but they just always also had a sense of humor about it, that somehow its value was caught up in and not overvaluing it as, like they were always, they just, how to put it? I mean, like, some of the poems I first read with Keith, he edited this anthology called Pegasus Descending of really bad poems, like the worst poems in English. Like, he was always laughing at his kind of own efforts, while also, of course, trying to write the best poems he could write. So I think they were just like this great mix of deep knowing and light touch, and that you write what's given to you to write, and you don't kind of, you have to follow the language. You can't kind of stay on brand or whatever. But they were I mean, very hands-off teachers, although everybody always said that Keith would never express like criticism, but whenever he would read my poems, he would always be like, oh, this is a terrible line, like you must. So.
I like to pivot a little bit, and we're in an age where the conversation is now much, as a person of color, I've always felt things that I feel like America is finally catching up and reckoning as a whole, particularly in more mainstream media and popular media. And a lot of this question about, toxic masculinity and white supremacy, and how one sort of informs another through a very lengthy tradition in this country, a country founded on Native American genocide and slavery. And I think one interesting thing that I really appreciated in your work here is that this diving into a milieu that so many folks, particularly in more progressive enclaves, would write off, or rather not be interested in seeing the formulation. And I think what you do, you patiently sort of build what I imagine were your neighbors, in the same way that I've seen my neighbors in rural Connecticut, and even now in rural Massachusetts, who would become or already Trump voters. So you're kind of mapping the life of the white male, particularly in youth, which is the most formative years where these ideas are fabricated, changed and then embedded. I want to bring forth this idea of social capital. I know it's a very popular term now, but I think I want to bring it back to Pierre Bourdieu's notion of social capital being a sort of commodity amongst sort of bourgeois networks of the knowledge of fine art, music, what have you, as codes of access amongst a sort of class. What was really interesting to me was how you employed hip hop amongst these white men as a sort of social capital. Can you talk a little bit about that decision? Because it's also not what we think about when we think of Bourdieu's notion, where Bourdieu would often talk about opera or more, refined or quote unquote high art. But I think you're absolutely right in, pinpointing a sort of medium of social capital through hip hop amongst these white young men who so happen are the most valiant and popular supporters of hip hop.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the answer is like, I don't know how to answer the question, right? I mean, it's an important question. I think that the novel is interested in a kind of imaginative poverty that's at the heart of privilege. I mean, a million people have written about this in different ways. I mean, James Baldwin's formulation of the lie of whiteness, the damage that the mythology of whiteness does to white people is just one kind of famous articulation, because there's nothing in this identity of whiteness. It's only the privilege to escape identity. It's only the privilege to be able to pass as universal. It's only the privilege, and then that privilege produces a kind of ventriloquism or a thirst for authenticity, because it's a vacuum. And we know the way that homophobic, misogynistic, racist violence is the traditional way you fill that vacuum, through the demotion of some other that you have to define yourself in opposition to. And in the Topeka School, the kind of white kids who were freestyling, on in the era of almost the era of Columbine, I wanted to capture the degree to which the kind of linguistic exchanges through which they pursue their social lives are almost parodically appropriated, right? These like totally inapplicable cliches of spectacularized images of African-American violence, which, as you imply, they're like largely funding by buying the records, right? So that the hip hop is, or the white kids freestyling in their suburban tract housing, is just one example of their hunger for a language of authenticity, where they have to appropriate even the vocabulary of keeping it real from the kind of gangster rap which they watch on television. I mean, I think the thing is that so it's really easy to make fun of that because it's cringeworthy, and it's really easy to denounce that, and it should be denounced as just another chapter in the endless history of white appropriation of cultural forms by people of color as markers of authenticity, which is totally compatible with all kinds of other forms of racism. But the novel also wants to kind of take seriously on a personal level the notion that Adam, even in these totally busted forms of linguistic appropriation, is still encountering experiences of flow or prosody or brief transports that do put him in touch, even in these totally outrageous forms, with the kind of power of language. So I think like the goal of the novel is to be ruthless about the racism and ugliness of moments of appropriation like that, but also to take seriously the hunger at the heart of privilege for something like identity, and those moments, it's not a defense of the appropriation, but those moments where language does have a power that is transpersonal, that's bigger than just the ugly and cliched appropriation of the voice of an other. So the novel wants to kind of like honor a moment of energy or force mixed into the kind of imaginative poverty of that moment, if it makes sense. And Adam's kind of thinking about his own prehistory as a poet too. I have a note here, Ocean, that says we should take questions from
Yeah, absolutely.
people too at some point. But I don't know is the answer to every
No, but I love that
big
answer.
question that you're answering.
I love that answer because it's sort of, it kind of, again, kind of supports this notion of how valuable a trilogy is, in that you can see all your novels sort of leading up to the political stakes in the Topeka School in a very earned way. It doesn't feel flippant, or it doesn't feel, forced in any way. That the accretion of the stakes go from Spain to New York, and to that beautiful scene in the basement in 1004, with the two co-op workers, where race and identity markers come and then vanish within a conversation, and how diaphanous those things are and ephemeral. I really appreciate that moment in Topeka School of you dissecting and pretty much showcasing or making evident the flip side of normalcy, which is often what hegemonic whiteness often achieves as a privilege. But the price of that privilege is that this vacuum of normalcy creates a great void that is filled with this thirst and hunger for authenticity and culture that can never be sort of replenished and filled. And then we see the alternative route, which is the Trump, supporter, and what Trump means for so many of these folks, is that this vacuum is now filled within its own ranks, this authentic, finally something true, our own grassroots, and which is why we see how powerful and sort of momentous it is, because it comes from the sort of depravity of the hegemonic, which is often, we don't see it as having a cost.
Yeah.
I think that tracking and mapping that is so important, particularly for white writers, because the question that, as a teacher myself, I have white students say, what do I write about? It's so hard. What do I, and I say, well, you have to begin by unpacking that whiteness is not a norm. It's created as such, that if you look at it piecemeal, if you look at every situation and ask the deeper questions, you arrive at a phenomena that the predominantly white canon has pretty much left explored still, right? So much of it. And I think that should be inspiring. And I think what you're doing in Topeka School is inspiring, is that here's an example of whiteness can look at itself in a way that puts itself accountable and creates new visions for what a novel can do, where a lot of folks are too nervous or too scared to go through it. You show that what we can see with care and perspicacity is that we can find the root of so much of the beauty and the terrors that we experience in our contemporary world. So it was really refreshing to see, and it's really inspiring to see you map your way towards that in the Topeka School.
Thank you.
Thank you both. You're both such incredible writers and have such different styles, but both so important for the American canon. We're almost out of time, but I would be really remiss if I didn't ask these two very important questions. The first one is, do you guys have a particular genre you prefer? I know you both started out in poetry, but made the successful transition, more than successful transition, into fiction. How do you guys feel about poetry versus fiction? Yeah, which one do you prefer?
What would you say to that, Ocean?
My sort of principles would say that there is no poetry versus fiction, that, like, similar to piggybacking on what you say, that for me, poetry is the pressurized language, and that can happen in any genre. But I would be remiss if I just didn't say that poetry makes me feel better. Like, I feel more pleasure writing poetry. And so I think I always turn to it, both as a writer and a reader, when I'm most destabilized, which is very often these days.
What about you, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I love all kinds of novels and prose writers and nonfiction writers, but part of it for me is, at this point, my emotional life, such as it is, like, so many of my best readers and interlocutors are poets. And even when we're talking about a work of prose, we're kind of attending to formal concerns or pressures that are maybe thought more of typically as the domain of poets. So I think yeah, poetry feels like the core for me, and like the compositional space in which like I'm most at home, precisely because I really don't know what I'm doing. I feel the push and pull of language on just this very primal level. But like Ocean said about the wall drips, or like the example of Ocean, a lot of my favorite poets are also novelists. So I don't think one has to choose.
Great. Okay, and the last question of the evening. Ocean, what's your favorite Frank Ocean song? And then Ben, if you don't have a favorite Frank Ocean song, who's your favorite hip hop artist?
Oh my goodness.
Because I can see Blonde in the background.
It's so hard. Oh my good. I don't know. I'm drawing a blank. Because I think Frank's work is, if you put them all together, it feels like one orchestra piece, right? So I think the moods blend. It's too hard to say.
It was a trick question. That's the answer I wanted. Thank you so much.
Okay.
What about you, Ben?
Ocean and I are both Frank Ocean fans. I don't have a favorite song, but there's somebody on YouTube has taken a lot of Frank Ocean songs and slowed them down. I mean, they work at any speed. Frank Ocean often plays his voice at different speeds, as you know, but has slowed them down and played them over fragments of classic anime films, and of like not even like plot, like just like a cityscape scene in rain or whatever from like a classic anime film. And my daughters and I often watch them. So instead of choosing a favorite, I like the manipulated Frank Ocean montage. The Moon River one is particularly beautiful.
Yeah.
Ooh, gonna have to check that out. Well, thank you both so much for being here. Many thanks again to our audience for being here. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this, and we cannot emphasize this enough. Continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. Please support Ben and PNP by using the link in the chat to purchase Topeka School. We also have plenty of copies of Ocean Vuong's book, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. For more PNP live events, check our website for updated listings. It's going to be a very exciting fall. And a final round of thanks to our amazing authors. And thank you all of us for joining us today. From all of us at Politics and Prose, stay safe, stay well read. We'll see you next time.
Thank you guys. And thank you, Ocean. I'll talk
Thank
to
you,
you soon.
Ben. It's good to see you.